about the 2012 economic outlook. Douglas Elmendorf told the Senate Budget Committee there will be slow economic growth this year with an unemployment rate of about 9%. This is a little more than 2 hours.
Hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to the Budget Committee today. Today's hearing will focus on CBO's new budget and economic outlook, which was released on Tuesday. Our witness is CBO's Director, Doug Elmendorf. I might say, very distinguished director. And I want to say how much I appreciate the work of the Congressional Budget Office, how credible I find it to be, how transparent I find it to be. And look, sometimes they strenuously disagree with me. I remember very well in health care, my major initiative, CBO critiqued very heavily. So that's the way it should be. Now, not that my proposal should have been critiqued as heavily as it was, but that's the way it works. That's why they have credibility, and they have credibility on both sides, because they tell it the way they see it. And that's really absolutely critical to the process. We've got to have some independent scorekeeper here. Are they always right? No. This is the work of men and women, and none of us are perfect. So no, their work is not perfect. It'd be impossible to have any entity on matters of this complexity be completely right every time. But they are independent, they are credible, they are serious people, and they're doing very important work for all of us. So, Director Elmendorf, welcome back to the committee. I want to thank you again for the outstanding work that you and your team have been doing, and with an extraordinarily heavy workload, really extraordinarily heavy. I believe you're leading CBO in an incredibly challenging time and have absolutely risen to the occasion. As I say, many times I disagree. I make my disagreements known. Sometimes you react to that. Most of the times you don't. That's fine. And I think Senator Sessions would say the same thing, that you guys play it straight. I want to begin by highlighting what I believe are the key finding in CBO's report. This first chart depicts the 10-year budget outlook under CBO's new alternative fiscal scenario. It shows the deficit falling to $1.1 trillion in 2012, continuing to fall through 2015, and then rising through the latter half of the decade, reaching $1.5 trillion in 2022. We cannot permit that to happen. Please, colleagues, let's find a way to get this country back on track. We can do better than this. We are better than this. And we've got an absolute obligation to try to find a way to come together to get this country back on track. It's important to note that most of the increased deficit over the next 10 years under CBO's alternative fiscal scenario can be attributed to tax policies, not spending policies. Specifically, we can see that $6.4 trillion of the increased deficit under the scenario can be attributed to the extension of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, alternative minimum tax relief, other tax extenders, and related debt service. In comparison, only $1.5 trillion of the increased deficit under the scenario can be attributed to spending policies, including extending the so-called doc fix, that is the reimbursement rate for doctors who treat Medicare patients, reversing the sequester required by the Budget Control Act, and again, related debt service, that is the interest savings that applies to those policies. Under the alternative fiscal scenario, gross federal debt is expected to reach 103% of gross domestic product this year, and then continue rising to 120% of GDP by 2022. Let me just indicate, Greece is about 140% of GDP on their debt, their sovereign debt. Many economists regard anything above the 90% threshold as the danger zone. And as disturbing as those near-term deficits and debt are, the long-term outlook is even more dire. In addition to our budget outlook, I look forward to Director Elmendorf's views on the state of the economy. I believe there are some positive signs we're now seeing for the economy. For example, we've experienced 22 consecutive months of private sector job growth. That's good. The unemployment rate has come down. That's good. We've seen 10 consecutive quarters of real GDP growth. That's good. Housing starts are up 25% since December of 2010. Consumer confidence is showing signs of improvement. U.S. auto manufacturers are returning to profitability and reported very strong sales in January. And state revenues are showing modest signs of improvement. But we cannot become complacent. Please, let no one take my reference to some positive indicators that we have solved these problems. There are serious risks out there to fuller economic recovery. Unemployment remains far too high and threatens to undermine consumer confidence. Housing continues to pose a threat, as we heard in yesterday's hearing, with too many homes still in foreclosure or underwater, with people owing more on the house than the house is worth. The political deadlock in Washington could block key measures. Federal, state, and local budget cuts could add to near-term fiscal drag. And the European debt and fiscal crisis is creating uncertainty and threatening U.S. exports and threatening to pull us into recession as Europe heads into recession. And I hope Director Elmendorf will comment on these positive signs and the risks to the economy in his testimony. I believe we need a policy that stresses both the fragility of the near-term economy and the need for long-term debt reduction. Let me say that again. My personal strong belief is we got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to take steps now to give additional lift to the economy. What I'm hearing from business is the problem with their deploying the $2 trillion on their balance sheets is a lack of demand. A lack of demand. Thin order books. So the Federal Reserve Chairman made very clear in his testimony before the Joint Economic Committee last fall, and let me quote from it, "Our crucial objective is to achieve long-run fiscal sustainability. The federal budget is clearly not on a sustainable path at present. A second important objective is to avoid fiscal actions that could impede the ongoing economic recovery." So, in the short term, we need more steps to strengthen the economy. In the medium and longer term, we need credible, serious action to address the debt threat. The first two objectives are certainly not incompatible, although to some people's ears they sound incompatible. Putting in place a credible plan for reducing future deficits over the longer term does not preclude attending to the implications of fiscal choices for the recovery in the near term. That, again, is a direct quote from the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. I believe he has it right. We must find a way to come together on a comprehensive and balanced plan to put our long-term fiscal house in order. That is critically important. At the same time, we must be careful not to take steps that could create additional fiscal drag in the near term, pushing us toward recession. That would make our deficit and debt situation worse, as our friends in England are finding out. There they put austerity measures in place, and their economic growth is slipping, and slipping markedly, and making their deficit and debt situation worse. Let's not repeat that mistake. That's why I believe it is so important that we extend the payroll tax cut, emergency unemployment benefits through the rest of this year, and perhaps even more important, that we engage in a Rebuild America plan to strengthen the infrastructure, because we not only have fiscal deficit, we have an infrastructure deficit in this country. And anybody that doesn't believe it, just go out on I-95 here in Washington, D.C. after 3:30 in the afternoon. That's why I believe it is so important we extend, as I said before, the payroll tax cut and emergency unemployment benefits, and put together a Build America plan to invest in infrastructure. By the way, Chairman Bernanke has made clear that he believes we ought to be thinking seriously about additional investments in infrastructure at this time. It's a twofer. Not only do you get increased demand at a time of weak demand, but right now you can get very good prices. And it improves the competitive position of the United States. We have had report after report that our infrastructure will not allow us to be fully competitive. And if you doubt that, go to China and see what they're doing with infrastructure. With that, we'll now turn to Senator Toomey. Senator Toomey is here filling in for Senator Sessions. Senator Sessions could not be with us at the early part of this morning, so Senator Toomey is filling in for him. Welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for getting here a little bit late. I was reminded of how challenging it can be to extricate oneself from the prayer breakfast. But it was a terrific event. I think Senator Sessions will be joining us shortly. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for being here. And if I could just take a brief moment, Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank Dr. Elmendorf and his staff for their terrific cooperation and support during the work of the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. That was a difficult and frustrating experience for me, but not because of your doing. And I just want to commend you and your staff for the really very, very professional, prompt, and thorough and thoughtful work that you provided, and the responsiveness that you gave us.
Could I just interrupt and ask, did you find that Director Elmendorf was always in agreement with your assessment on these matters, or did you have the experience like mine that I often find he doesn't agree with my position?
It was my experience that in the most civil and diplomatic way, he expressed his disagreement. But I appreciated his candor and his help. Just a few thoughts, if I could, Mr. Chairman. First, I would suggest that the comments have been attributed to you that suggest that you may be considering pursuing a budget resolution within the committee. You and I have not had a chance to discuss that, but I would just want to encourage you as strongly as I possibly can. I think that's something the committee should take up. I hope we will. And then I hope very much that we will take this up as a full body. And I have to say, I am very, very disappointed that we're going into our third year without a budget. And I think that is a failure to accept the responsibility that the United States Senate has. I hope we will at least remedy that for this year and going forward. I understand that the Budget Control Act does provide as a substitute in certain respects, but it's certainly not a full substitute for a budget resolution. And I happen to be a fan of establishing discretionary spending caps, and that legislation, as you know, does that. But there are many other things that a budget resolution sort of uniquely addresses. And I hope that we will take it up in committee, and then the full body will.
If I could just answer you on that point, Senator Toomey. Number one, I believe the Budget Control Act has put in place for 2 years a deeming resolution, which has been used in the past to set budget aggregates, and that is in place, and it's the law. It also provides the enforcement mechanism. It also provides, as you indicated, 10 years of spending caps. I am committed to going to markup in this committee. I think it is important. The only year we didn't do it was last year when, in effect, we got big-footed by negotiations above our pay level with leaders of the House and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, in the White House. And I look very much forward to our trying, in this committee, to find agreement. You've struggled with us. I did on the Fiscal Commission, have in the group of 6. I think it'd be healthy for the body, healthy for the country, and I am looking forward to it. And one of the things we need to establish today is when we might get the reestimates from CBO, because that could affect the timing of when we go to markup in the committee. I hope that's one thing that we can learn today, what the best estimate of the director is.
Thank you.
I don't want this to interrupt Senator Toomey's time.
Well, I won't take up too much more time. We have other members that want to speak. So let me just say a couple of points that I think are worth stressing. One is I think it's very hard to overstate the fiscal danger we have gotten ourselves into, the severity of the challenge that we face. 2012 will be the 4th straight year with a $1 trillion-plus deficit. Under any scenario, we're going to add trillions of dollars of additional debt over the coming years. Under any plausible scenario, it certainly looks like our debt-to-GDP ratio will continue to worsen in the absence of structural reform of the big programs that are driving this program. And I would suggest that the debt-to-GDP ratio is probably the single most important metric we should be looking at from the point of view of our budget. We are on path such that by the end of this fiscal year, this administration and the Congress, working together or not, will have added nearly as much to our nation's debt as all the previous administrations in the history of the Republic. A quick observation. I know we all know this on the committee, but I think it bears reinforcing the point that the current law baseline is not meant to be any kind of a prediction. It's a yardstick in a way. It's a measuring tool. That's the way I look at it anyway, against which we compare policy alternatives. And I think that's important because if you look at that, at some level, one might take a quick glance and suggest that it suggests a relatively benign outlook. In fact, the outlook is anything but benign. It's very, very serious and very, very troubling. And even the current law baseline projection shows in the latter years of this 10-year window accelerating size of deficits and mounting debt and a trajectory that becomes all the more worrisome. The alternative fiscal scenario is also not really meant to be anybody's prediction of the future, I think it's fair to say, but it's probably a somewhat closer approximation to what's more likely to occur. And when you look at that picture, of course, it's very grim indeed. By 2022, under the alternative fiscal scenario, spending exceeds $6 trillion. It is 24.4% of GDP. This is a post-war structural high. It has the debt reaching 94% of GDP. And as with the current law scenario, the deficits are accelerating, they're ramping up, they're trending up in the latter years. And frankly, that's the case regardless of what set of assumptions you use, because in the absence of structural reform of the big entitlement programs, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's my view that the problem that we have is a spending problem. It is more specifically a mandatory spending problem. It's interesting to note that if you look at these scenarios, over time, discretionary spending actually drops considerably as a percentage of GDP. And despite that, we have huge spending, huge deficit, huge debt problems. There's only one possible explanation, and that is it's being driven by the mandatory spending side. And I would say, to be more precise, it is healthcare spending that is the real driver of this problem. The President himself said, and I will quote, "Our long-term debt and deficits are caused primarily by escalating healthcare costs that we see in Medicare and Medicaid that is putting huge pressure on the overall budget." The President also said, and this is a quote, "If you look at the numbers, Medicare in particular will run out of money, and we will not be able to sustain that program no matter how much taxes go up." I think that is a very important observation. I think it's exactly correct. And I think it's very unfortunate that he has nevertheless failed to give us a proposal that would change the architecture of these programs in a way that makes them sustainable and viable for the budget and also for future generations of Americans that will need it. The fact is, Medicare is growing at several multiples of the rate of economic growth. Medicaid is growing faster than that. And no significant program can grow faster than the economy for an extended period of time. It's just arithmetically not possible to sustain that. So I hope we'll use this occasion to reinforce the need to pursue in a bipartisan fashion the kind of architectural reform to these programs that's needed. The last point I would just make is that, and I think this is consistent with some of the things the Chairman said, although we have different views of how to get there, and that's just the importance of maximizing economic growth. It's, of course, primarily important to maximize growth because this is how we create jobs and elevate the standard of living of the people that we represent, the people across America. But of course, it's also enormously important from a budgetary point of view. The CBO estimates on page 108, I think, of the report that a 1/10 of a percentage point increase in economic growth and GDP growth over the 10-year period of time generates, in their estimate, over $300 billion of additional revenue. Now, I know this is not purely linear, but let's just roughly say that means that 1% of economic growth, sustained, stronger growth, is worth about $3 trillion in deficit reduction. There is no better way to reduce the size of our deficits and help to contribute to a sustainable path than through stronger economic growth. So I certainly hope that we will pursue the policies that will maximize growth and change the architecture of the programs that are fundamentally driving our deficits. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Senator. Let me just say, one place where we are in strong agreement is economic growth got to be the cornerstone of any policy that we advance. That has got to be the goal, because that helps us with deficits and debt more than any other thing we could do. If we don't have growth, our deficits and debt become more dire, more serious. So I think one place we might agree with respect to economic growth is we have a tax system that was never designed with that in mind. We had a tax system that was designed when, frankly, we did not have to worry about America's competitive position. Now we do. And so I would put high on the agenda the need for fundamental tax reform with economic growth in mind, as well as fairness, but also with an understanding that we're in a different world. There's a global economy, and we've got real competition. That's a place I think we might find agreement. Let me just say the place where I disagree is this is just a spending problem. As I look at our current condition, our spending, yes, is a problem, without question. We are at or near a 60-year high as a share of GDP on the spending side. But on the revenue side, we are at or near a 60-year low. So I don't know how, if one is concerned about the gap between spending and revenue, how one can just focus on one side of the equation. I think we've got to focus on both sides of the equation, and I think we have got to find ways to generate more revenue without increasing tax rates, because that would hurt our competitive position. And I think the place we ought to look is tax expenditures, which are running now well over $1 trillion a year. We're spending more through the tax code than we're spending in all of the appropriated accounts. And we give it much less review. I'm on the Finance Committee, and one thing that just strikes you is how wasteful some of it is. So, look, I think we've got a charge here. Yes, we have got to get tough on the spending side of the equation. Yes, entitlements, I believe, have to be reformed. I agree entirely with your analysis. I mean, health care is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. But it's not just the federal accounts, it's health care expenditures across the economy. We're now spending 18% of our GDP in health care, one of every $6. So we've got a big societal challenge. With that, Director Elmendorf, please proceed with your testimony, and then we're going to go to questions. And again, thank you for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Toomey, and thanks to both of you for your kind words about the work of my colleagues. I am very lucky to have this opportunity to lead such exceptionally talented and dedicated public servants. All of us at CBO are very appreciative of the support that you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Toomey, Senator Sessions, and all the members of the committee have shown for our work, and we will continue to do our very best to give you and the rest of the Congress the information that you need in making the very important decisions the country faces. I'll be referring this morning to the charts in front of you. Let me begin by noting, and Senator Toomey said this quite eloquently, that our baseline economic and budgetary projections are conditioned on current law, not because we expect there will be no changes in law, but because this approach provides a benchmark against which potential changes can be measured. What we are presenting is a benchmark, not a forecast, and that distinction has important implications in reading our projections. What is our assessment of the economic outlook? The pace of the recovery has been slow since the recession ended 2.5 years ago. And we project that it will continue to be slow for the next 2 years, reflecting both the lingering effects of the financial crisis and recession and the fiscal restraint that will arise under current law. Specifically, current law fiscal policy will reduce the growth of output slightly in 2012 and significantly in 2013 through a combination of large tax increases and large spending cuts. Our projections incorporate the upcoming expiration of the payroll tax cuts and emergency unemployment benefits, the expiration of the tax cuts enacted in 2001, 2003, and 2009, as well as other expiring tax provisions, the constraints on spending imposed in last year's Budget Control Act, and the winding down of the budgetary effects of the 2009 Recovery Act. Taken together, those policies will generate a sharp fiscal contraction. In addition, the excess number of houses, loss of wealth, run-up in debt, and other legacies of the economic downturn are continuing to weigh on household and business spending. If you look at the first chart in the packet, we project that real GDP will grow by only 2% this year and only about 1% next year. We expect economic activity to quicken after 2013, but real GDP to remain below the economy's potential through 2017. According to our projections, the economy is only about halfway through the cumulative shortfall in output that will result from the recession and its aftermath. The costs associated with that persistent output gap are immense, and they are borne disproportionately by people who lose their jobs, who are displaced from their homes, or who own businesses that fail. In particular, the labor market has a great deal of slack, mainly as a consequence of continued weakness in demand for goods and services. You can see in the second picture, in our forecast, the unemployment rate remains above 8%, both this year and next. As economic growth picks up after 2013, the unemployment rate declines in our projection, but remains above 7% until 2015, before dropping to 5.25% by the end of the coming decade. While the economy continues to be weak during the next few years, inflation and interest rates will remain low. Let me turn now to our budget projections. In the next slide, under current law, we expect that this year's deficit will be about $1.1 trillion. At 7% of GDP, that is nearly 2 percentage points less than the deficit recorded last year, but still larger than any deficit between 1947 and 2008. Over the next few years, projected deficits in our baseline narrow sharply, averaging 1.5% of GDP and totaling about $3 trillion between 2013 and 2022. With deficits small relative to the size of the economy, debt held by the public drops a little as a share of GDP, but remains quite high. Much of the projected decline in the deficit occurs because, under current law, revenues will rise considerably. In particular, between 2012 and 2014, revenues in our baseline shoot up by more than 30% because of the recent or scheduled expirations of various tax provisions and new taxes and other collections that are scheduled to go into effect. Federal spending in the baseline declines modestly relative to GDP in the next few years as the economy expands and statutory caps constrain discretionary appropriations. Later in the decade, spending turns up again relative to GDP because of increasing expenses generated by the aging of the population and rising costs for health care, and because the accumulation of debt and rising interest rates will cause a surge in the government's interest costs. Of course, these baseline projections are heavily influenced by the changes in tax and spending policies that are embodied in current law, changes that in some cases represent a significant departure from recent policies. To illustrate the budgetary consequences of maintaining some tax and spending policies that have recently been in effect, CBO developed projections under an alternative fiscal scenario. Look at the next slide. That scenario incorporates the following assumptions. First, that all expiring tax provisions other than the payroll tax reduction are extended. Second, that the alternative minimum tax, or AMT, is indexed for inflation after 2011. Third, that Medicare's payment rates for physician services are held constant at their current level, rather than dropping by 27% in March and more thereafter, as scheduled under current law. And fourth, that the automatic spending reductions required by the Budget Control Act in the absence of legislation from the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction do not take effect, although the scenario assumes that the original caps on discretionary spending would remain in place. The next slide shows that under that alternative fiscal scenario, deficits over the 2013-2022 period would be far higher than in the baseline, averaging 5.5% of GDP rather than 1.5%, and totaling $11 trillion rather than roughly $3 trillion. And the following slide shows the debt held by the public would climb on an unsustainable path under that scenario, reaching 94% of GDP in 2022, the highest figure since just after the Second World War. I want to emphasize that this scenario, like the baseline, is not a prediction or a recommendation. We put it together just to illustrate for you the effects of an alternative set of policies. Under that scenario, the economy would be noticeably stronger during the next few years than under current law, but noticeably weaker later in the decade. The report presents estimates of those effects using ranges of numbers to reflect the uncertainty involved. The midpoints of the ranges for the end of 2013 show GNP that is 2% higher and an unemployment rate that is 1% lower, 1 percentage point lower than would be the case under current law. However, the midpoint of the range for 2022 shows GNP that is almost 2.5% lower than under current law because of the crowding out of investment that would be caused by the escalating debt. It bears emphasis that projecting economic outcomes for any path of fiscal policy and the budget outcomes that would result is very difficult. Many things could happen to cause the economy and the budget to turn out better or worse than we project. However, there is no plausible economic outcome under which the policies of the alternative fiscal scenario would lead to a sustainable budget outcome. The fundamental fiscal challenge, as both Chairman Conrad and Senator Toomey have noted, remains the aging of the population and rising costs for health care. The number of people aged 65 or older will increase by 1/3 in the coming decade, substantially raising the cost of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. In addition, the Affordable Care Act will significantly increase the number of non-elderly people receiving assistance through federal health care programs. Furthermore, CBO projects that the costs per enrollee for Social Security and especially the major health care programs will continue to rise, both over the coming decade and beyond. Because of these forces, the set of budget policies that were in effect in the past cannot be maintained in the future. If we turn to the next slide, we offer one way to think about the problem, using CBO's projections under the alternative fiscal scenario, which, as I've said, represents a continuation of many recent and current policies. In this bar chart, each pair of bars represents a broad component of the federal budget as a share of GDP, with the left pair of the bars showing the average during the past 40 years, and the right bar our projection for 2022 under this alternative scenario. In that scenario, outlays for Social Security and the health care programs, the first set of bars, would be much higher than in the past, 5.5% of GDP higher than on average during the past 40 years. Outlays for all other federal programs, meaning both defense and non-defense discretionary spending and all entitlements except for the particular large ones in the first set of bars, outlays for all those programs together are projected to be much lower than in the past. About 8% of GDP, that's below any year in the past 40 years, and well below the 11% of GDP that such outlays have averaged over that period. Yet the budget deficit under this scenario, shown on the far right, is projected to be 6.1% of GDP. As I've shown under that scenario, debt rises rapidly relative to GDP. To keep debt from rising relative to GDP, the deficit would need to be about 3.5% of GDP smaller in 2022 than we project under this scenario. That's $900 billion in 2022 alone relative to this scenario. Therefore, to put the federal budget on a sustainable path, policymakers will need to allow federal revenues to increase to a much higher percentage of GDP than on average over the past 40 years, or make very large changes to Social Security and federal health care programs, or pursue some combination of those strategies. Let me close by highlighting the consequential choices that you and your colleagues face this year. On one hand, if policymakers leave current law unchanged, the federal debt will probably recede slowly relative to the size of the economy, as shown in our baseline. That will occur because of a large increase in revenues and sharp restraints on federal spending, apart from the particular programs I've highlighted. However, both of those changes from historical patterns will have significant economic and social effects. Moreover, the sharp fiscal restraint will markedly slow the economic recovery. On the other hand, changing current laws to let current policies continue would boost the economy and allow people to pay less in taxes and benefit more from government programs and services in the next few years, but would put the nation on an unsustainable fiscal course. If policymakers wanted to achieve both a short-term economic boost and medium-term and long-term fiscal sustainability, they would need to enact policies that leave deficits significantly wider than our current law baseline during the next few years, but significantly narrower than under our alternative scenario by later in the decade. In conclusion, how much and how quickly the budget deficit declines over the coming decade will depend, in part, on how well the economy does. Probably more critical, though, will be the choices made by you and your colleagues as you face the substantial changes to tax and spending policies slated to take effect this year. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Director Elmendorf. Let me start out, if I could, by saying you have said repeatedly, your report shows, that we're on a budget track that is unsustainable. Deficits are too high, too much debt. But you also say in this report that if we let the tax cuts expire, as is provided for in current law, and if we impose the spending cuts required by current law, economic growth, according to your analysis, will actually plunge. And we started out with Senator Toomey and I agreeing on one thing, that we got to have policies that strengthen economic growth. And yet you are saying that current law, which ends the Bush-era tax cuts at the end of this year, and current law also imposes spending cuts, sequestration that is in line, that would cut economic growth about in half. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chairman.
So, you know, I think it is very confusing to people because it sounds like double talk to them. How can it be that on the one hand, we're saying deficits and debt are a big problem, but on the other hand, if we cut spending and raise revenue, which over time will reduce deficits, that if we did it now, it will dramatically reduce economic growth and make our economic situation worse? How can both those things be true?
As you know, Mr. Chairman, it is not double talk, but it is complicated. In the short term, especially given the state of our economy today, the constraint on output and jobs is really the demand for goods and services, which plummeted in the financial crisis and recession and is only slowly coming back. Over the medium term and long term, the constraint on output in this economy is not particularly the demand for goods and services. It is the ability of the economy to supply those goods and services. It is the size and skill of the labor force, the quantity of capital with which they work, the productivity with which the labor and capital are combined to produce output. This is actually a consensus part of economic thinking, that in the short term, in economies that have a lot of underused and unused people, factories, houses, and so on, that efforts to boost the demand for goods and services can help put people back to work. But that over time, the bigger issue is whether people are doing enough saving, whether there are people who are coming to work who can find jobs. And so what countries have found is that very rapid imposition of fiscal restraint tends, not always, but tends to slow economies in the short term. Now, some countries have no choice. I'm not trying to second-guess the decisions made by policymakers in Europe. When countries can't sell their debt or fear that they may not be able to sell their debt tomorrow, then they sometimes need to make drastic changes in fiscal policy overnight. And in our issue brief on the risk of a fiscal crisis in this country a few years ago, we highlighted the fact that if one waits to address fiscal problems until the creditors won't lend you money anymore, that often happens right when the economies are weakest and it's hardest to address the problem. So once countries have gotten to that point, sometimes they have no choice but to make that sort of overnight change. But if one can plan ahead, then it helps households and businesses and state and local governments to adjust to the change in policies. I want to say this is not, in any case, an argument for deferring decision-making. There really isn't a downside to the Congress deciding how it wants to put the country on a sustainable fiscal path. The issue is, given a plan, how quickly should the pieces take effect? And there are reasons for waiting, which I'm laying out. There are also, of course, reasons for not waiting too long. We've written a lot and talked a lot about the dangers of the escalating debt. But there is a balancing act in how quickly the policies take effect.
So why wouldn't one conclude from what you've said here that the best policy in the short term would be to extend tax cuts, at least some significant part of the tax cuts, and defer some of the spending cuts, for example, part of the sequester, for several years, but right now agree to a plan that will raise revenue and cut spending so that at the end of the 10 years we've dramatically reduced deficits and reduced the growth of debt?
So I don't want to speak to a specific combination of policies that Congress might choose to extend or let expire. That's a decision for you. As you know, we've done analysis of the stimulative effects for output and employment of particular sets of policies, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But on your general point, I think agreement about how the country's budget will be put on a sustainable path would be a good thing for the economy in the short run, because it would give people some confidence that they knew where policies were headed, which is very hard to have in the current environment. And if a set of policies was put in place that put the country on a sustainable fiscal path, and people believed those policies would be allowed to take effect when they were scheduled to do so, then I think that would be a good thing for business investment and hiring and for consumer spending, and would help to boost the economy right away.
But wouldn't the logical conclusion of the testimony you've provided be that in the short term we should take steps that might actually increase deficits and debt if that was married with a longer-term plan that credibly, substantially reduced deficits and debt?
Well, yes, I think so, if I understand you right. The policies that would widen the deficit relative to the very sharp fiscal restraint in our current law baseline, relative to that benchmark, policies that widen the deficit for a few years would be beneficial for the economy over that period if they were, especially if they were, as you say, combined with a plan that later narrowed deficits relative to the current policy projections that we've shown you here. Combining those pieces is important because people might otherwise interpret short-term widening of the deficit as simply a precursor for further widening down the road. And so the proposal that you mentioned about having those pieces together, I think would be the strongest, provide the strongest boost to economic activity in the short term.
But those longer steps to deal with deficits and debt would have to be credible and have to be an assurance that they were put in place.
Yes, I think we've written, and I've said in previous testimonies, that to make intended future actions matter for people's behavior today, they need to be credible. Part of that is they need to be specific, and they need to have, I think, reasonably widespread support, so that people didn't think that they would be quickly overturned down the road.
Senator Toomey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think one of the problems with the solution along the lines of what you have described arises from the fact that, of course, the only Congress we control is the one that we're a member of. And it would... We're not so sure about that. And we're not so sure about that. So the idea of widening the deficit on the promise that it will be narrowed in the future is one that would be challenging for me to accept, that we have a good reason to believe that it will actually be carried through. Having said that, statutory changes in the architecture of the programs driving this that passed and with bipartisan support and were signed into law, those would tend to be enduring. And I think that we could have some reason to be confident that such changes that would go into effect, not tomorrow or even next year, but years down the road, could in fact solve the problem and would be credible if they were done that way. Just quickly on this vein, though, in this discussion that you had with the chairman, I think sometimes there's a suggestion that from the point of view of economic growth, government spending and lower taxes are somehow equivalent, because from a sort of Keynesian demand side, they both provide a stimulus that generates economic growth. And I understand that analysis, but I would suggest, and I don't know if you agree or not, Dr. Elmendorf, but my own view is there's one very important way in which they differ, and in which lower tax, specifically lower marginal tax rates and lower taxes on investment, have an effect on economic growth, a positive effect that spending doesn't have, and that is in the incentive component, the extent to which lower marginal rates encourage more work, more savings, more investment, more risk-taking in a way that more government spending does not. And that therefore, while I can acknowledge the Keynesian argument that they're somehow equivalent from a demand side, they're not equivalent on the supply side. And I don't know if you share that view. I have a different view.
No, I think you're correct, Senator. Even on the demand side, in analysis we've done for this committee, presented in testimony last fall, different sorts of specific changes in tax policy or spending policy could have very different effects, we estimate, on the economy in the short run.
Right.
So even within one of those categories, not everything is alike. And I think you're right to emphasize the importance of the incentive effects of changes in tax rates for medium-term and long-term growth. Certain aspects of government spending can matter as well. We can talk about infrastructure spending and so on. But you're right to emphasize the importance of tax rates.
Now, earlier, the chairman challenged my assertion that what we have is a spending problem, and he observed correctly that revenue is at a relatively low point, a multi-year low as a percentage of GDP. But the tax regime that we have in place has been in place now for almost 10 years, and it seems to me that the low revenue number that we have as a percentage of GDP is a function of a weak economy. Slow growth, lesser output, far more people unemployed and therefore not paying taxes, and that is by far the main driver of why we don't have greater revenue coming from the current rate structure. Is it your view that the economic slowdown has been a big driver of the decline in revenue as a percentage of GDP?
Yes, the economic slowdown has been the principal factor. Of course, for higher tax rates, one might collect more revenue from our given tax base. But you're right about the sharp decline in taxable income.
Right. And the other point that I would make is that if you look at your alternative fiscal scenario, in which you assume that all the current rates remain in place, in fact, revenue returns to its historical norm. then really within a few years, actually, it exceeds the 18% of GDP that has been the historical average. So in that sense, we are on a course with the current tax rates for revenue to be normal again, at least normal as measured by America's history.
Yes.
What doesn't revert to normal is spending. Spending stays at an elevated percentage of GDP indefinitely, and then it gets worse. It accelerates. Is that
yes, that's right. As I showed in the bar chart, and you highlighted particular types of spending.
So that's why you know, if you believe that fundamentally spending needs to be and ought to be a greater share of our economy and taxes ought to be a greater share than historically they've been, okay, that's a perfectly legitimate point of view, but that's a departure from what has been the norm in this country for decades. The last point I would make on this is that as recently as 2007, the current tax regime generated more than 18% of GDP in revenue to the government and a deficit of only 1.2% of GDP, a deficit that was adding to the debt at a rate slower than the economy was growing, and therefore establishing that goal, that I think that should be our goal, of debt to GDP ratio that would be declining.
Yes.
I'll yield, Mr. Chairman.
Let me pick up on the point because I think it's hugely important. And this is where we have a difference of opinion. Average revenue over 40 years, about 18% of GDP, I think 18.1. The problem with that is there have been only 5 times we've balanced in the last 30 years. And every time we've balanced, revenue was not at 18% or 19%. Revenue was at 19.6, 19.7, 19.8, 20.6. And that's before the demographic time bomb that's going on in this country, the aging of the baby boom generation, and that's not a projection. Those people have been born, they're alive today, they're going to be eligible for Medicare and Social Security. And so that, to me, has got to be taken into account on what kind of revenue level we need to achieve to take on this debt threat and have the kinds of Medicare, Social Security programs that the vast majority of Americans say they support. I entirely agree with the Senator. The spending is going to have to come down in nominal terms, in real terms, because it is at or near a 60-year high. But I personally don't believe we're going to bell this cat or they're going to achieve agreement to make changes on entitlements if we don't also make changes on the revenue side. And I, for one, I'm ready to deal with entitlements. It's entirely clear to me that what we've been doing so far is trying to solve this on the discretionary side of the equation. Senator quite appropriately mentioned what's happening there. That spending is actually going down, and going down quite markedly. But we have not been able to deal with the entitlement side. So, Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, as always, for your thoughtful perspective. And Mr. Elmendorf, we thank you and your team for their work. I think over and over again, what you're saying is we needed the super committee to work. We need to have a long-term plan that both deals with the short term in terms of what is happening around jobs. We know we'll never get out of debt with 13 million people out of work, but we also have to focus on the long term. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to say, Mr. Chairman, just to reiterate, I thank you for your work on the Budget Control Act. And in fact, it may have been a little different process, but we did pass a budget last year, just for the record, and I think there's been a manufactured political issue around whether or not it was done in the normal process or through something called the Budget Control Act, but it certainly was done with budget caps, and we can go further this year, but we certainly have put in place both a budget framework and appropriations. Within that, let me also just say for a moment that we in agriculture did our part, and I just, because we did a lot of hard work together with CBO, I want to thank you very much for burning the late night candles, the people who were in your shop working with us around the clock. We made a commitment, Chairman Lucas and I and Senator Roberts and Congressman Pearson, to come up with a bipartisan, bicameral deficit reduction proposal. We did that. We're very proud that we did that. Agriculture is slightly less than 2% of federal outlays, and the $23 billion that we recommended with CBO scoring and legislative language was slightly less than 2% of the cut required. So we met our fair share, and I want to thank your staff for all of their efforts in that effort.
Thank you, Senator. I'll pass that along.
Yes. Let me speak on a couple of other things. I want to ask a question, but let me also say that when we look long term, I think it's important for us also to look at the fact that we have begun to tackle some things. Within the Affordable Care Act, we tackled overpayments on Medicare Advantage. Some said it wouldn't work. I'm very pleased to see the numbers that have just come out for 2011, that premiums are down 7%, even though enrollment is up 10%. So we're beginning that projection that came from your shop of $143 billion over 10 years in reduction in health care costs. It looks like it's beginning to happen. The second decade, I understand, was a quarter to 0.5% of GDP, which translates to about $1.3 trillion. So I'm pleased to see that, at least in part, there's more that needs to be done, but what was done under the Affordable Care Act certainly has moved us in a direction of bringing down costs, and I'm pleased to see that. I'd like to ask you about the economy and certainly in the short run. You know, coming from Michigan, we've had the biggest swing. 3 years ago, we were tapped out at 15.7% unemployment. It's now 9.3%, certainly up in the country, but still way too high. And I wonder if you might just talk more about the importance of creating jobs and the impact on the deficit in the economy, because what you've been talking about on the demand side, that's jobs. That's people having money in their pocket so they can buy things, care for their families. And it's so critical, I think, that we focus immediately on jobs in the economy if we're going to get out of this deficit hole. If you could speak more to that.
So Senator, stronger economic performance is very good for the federal budget, mostly because it increases tax receipts. People have more income on which to pay tax. Also because it reduces spending for unemployment benefits and other things. It's separately the case that certain sorts of reductions in taxes or increases in government spending can spur economic growth, and we provided this committee and others with estimates of that. One shouldn't, though, put those pieces together and assume that, therefore, some lower taxes or higher spending will boost the economy so much that that will raise tax revenue enough to pay for the entire extra fiscal cost. That's not the case. So there is some benefit to the federal budget of budgetary actions that spur the economy, but in almost every case not enough to pay for the direct cost of those actions. We've provided some both in an appendix to this report and in a letter we wrote to Congressman Van Hollen in October, some more specific estimates of how certain amounts of improvement in economic performance would benefit the budget, and we can have to talk with you about those more carefully if you'd like.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Thank the Senator. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Director. Thanks for your testimony. You know, I agree with you that if we're really going to move ourselves in the direction of economic growth and heal this deficit, we need a credible and specific plan. And of course, the first step in that is going to actually have the Congress pass a budget, and specifically the Senate pass a budget. And unfortunately, we're going to be starting a week late in terms of the timetable set out in the Congressional Budget Act in 1974. The President's going to be 1 week late in submitting his budget. I certainly want to keep this committee's feet to the fire to try and get our work done with our budget proposal submitted by April 1st. In talking to Chairman Conrad, he said one of the problems that might hold us up there is CBO's re-estimation of the budget So can you give me some sort of timeline and give me assurances it won't hold up our work here?
Well, Senator, just as you want to hold the committee's feet to the fire, this committee and the House Budget Committee are holding our feet to the fire. We are starting a week late, as you said. Right. We will push along just as fast as we can. In conversations that we've had with the budget committees, we've said that we are aiming to release our March baseline and our analysis of the President's budget by the middle of March.
Okay.
Whether we can keep to that depends, importantly, on what turns up in the budget, which we haven't seen, and how hard it is for us to do the analysis of it. It also depends on what else Congress demands of us. We've made a tour of the leadership in the Democratic and Republican sides in the Senate and the House and pleaded for forbearance in doing estimates of other sorts of legislation over the next month and a half so we can focus on providing this new baseline, which is crucial for our your legislative work of the year and our estimates.
I appreciate that. And of course, I didn't make a demand, but I did have a request that we spoke about earlier.
Yes.
I'm certainly concerned. I want to ask you in general about the risks to the budget that you see. You know, what in addition to the baseline, you know, what are the risks? You know, certainly from my standpoint, we've had this discussion. I'm highly concerned about what the true cost of the health care law is. Specifically, we had conversations about, I believe, credible evidence that this is underestimated in terms of the number of employees that will lose their employer-sponsored care. It sounds like your office has been working on that. Can you just give me an update in terms of when we might have a reassessment of that estimate?
Yes. The first thing is that this outlook doesn't include a comprehensive reestimate of the coverage provisions of the Affordable Care Act. That will be part of our March baseline. It's a very involved process. We actually get more health data at this time of year. So it's not in here. It will be in the March baseline. So you will see in that our assessment, our best assessment at that point of the effects of the law. We're also separately working on an analysis that is well along but not yet finished of the consequences for the budget if we are wrong in our assessment of the effects of the legislation. And we're looking at a range of alternative parameter values of some of the crucial assumptions. And each of those requires us to do a whole separate set of estimates, essentially, so it takes some time. But we're pushing hard on that, and as soon as that's done, we will give that to the Congress. A number of people have asked.
I really would encourage you to take a look at a realistic worst-case scenario, because we are far, far from that with the million-person estimate right now. Douglas Holsaken talked about 35 million. I would argue far higher, having bought health care and made those decisions. So, again, I encourage you to really take a hard look at that.
I understand, Senator.
In terms of risk to the budget, from my standpoint, cost of health care, interest rate risk, I'm looking at your interest rate assumptions. They certainly don't take into account should we hit a European-style debt crisis. Speaking of Europe, I don't see anything, or I'm certainly concerned about what could happen of budgetary effects of a European contagion. We had an excellent hearing here yesterday to that effect. And the suggestion really was from those witnesses, have CBO take a look at that as potentially an alternate scenario. And then just growth projections. What is, by the way, the last 50 years, what is the average growth rate of the U.S. economy?
Senator Johnson, could I just stop you on that point? Because Senator Johnson has said something, and I don't want to let this moment pass by without riveting the point. I don't want it to just kind of float by here. What he is saying is exactly correct with respect to yesterday's hearing, and they suggested that we ask CBO to take a look at what we might expect if we have a further erosion in Europe. And I think that is absolutely critical because it's one of the biggest risk factors that we face out there. I want to make sure this doesn't come off Senator Johnson's time. So restore his time.
That took about 5 minutes, by the way. Well, thank you, Senator Conrad. That is important. So just getting back to my primary point, I've just listed 4 things. I would encourage CBO to really take a look at what are significant risks and give us some sort of feedback on that.
So as you know, Senator, these projections that we make are fraught with uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And the uncertainty is very wide. In particular, projections of the deficit or projections of the difference between 2 very, very large numbers. And one doesn't have to be off by very much in the projection of revenues or the projection of spending to be off by a large multiple of the projected deficit. We work very hard to have projections that are in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. It's not our objective, as described by the Congress, for us to deliver the worst case projection, but we do think about alternatives. We were not able in this report to illustrate the effects of alternatives quantitatively. We have, as you know, in the appendix, a table that looks at some rules of thumb, but we didn't go all the way from what particular things happen in Europe or elsewhere, how would that matter. For what it's worth, the projection is conditioned on what we say is a shallow recession in the Eurozone. I think that's consistent with the current consensus forecasts of what's going on in Europe. The effects of Europe on the U.S. economy, or the effects of a European financial implosion on the U.S. economy are, of course, very complicated. Part of that, you mentioned this earlier, Mr. Chairman, is the effect on our net exports. If they are out of work, buying less, one place they'll buy less from is here. But we think a more important channel of transmission from their problems to us is actually through the financial system. We've had a number of conversations on this topic with our panel of economic advisors in the past several meetings, and their view is that it's really on the financial side. I think the current understanding is that U.S. financial institutions don't have a lot of direct exposure to the most troubled economies in Europe. But as we saw in the financial crisis here, the danger comes not just from the one link away, it's 2 links or 3 links away in this very interconnected financial system.
Okay, let me sneak one last point in here. Currently, a huge debate really is about the expiration of the Bush tax cuts and differentiating them between the wealthy and the less well-off. Okay, what is the effect of the Bush tax expiration on the top $250,000 income earners? I mean, how many dollars is that per year over a 10-year window versus the rest of the tax cuts?
So I don't have a precise number, but roughly, from the last time I've seen estimates of this sort from the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, who are the people who do those estimates, about 1/5 of the total amount of revenue related to the extension of the 2001, 2003, so on tax cuts is attributable to the top tax rates, and 4/5 is attributable to all the other provisions.
Put some numbers on that. What's top tax rates and how many dollars are we talking about?
So the total number that we show in our in the outlook is about $4.5 trillion for extending certain income tax and estate and gift tax provisions and indexing the AMT for inflation. So 1/5 of $4.5 trillion is about $900 billion.
Okay,
and then there's some debt service.
And when you say top income tax rates, that's income earners over, what's the cutoff?
I don't remember the exact cutoff, to be honest. Again, these are estimates the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation does. They don't come directly from us, and I don't have those numbers in hand.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Senator Begich.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Let me first ask kind of it's interesting as I'm sitting here listening, you're hearing, I've now been here 3 years, it's kind of deja vu, the debate that we're going to have here. And the real question is, how do we craft the right package? And you've given some scenarios, and let me ask it in a question. Do you believe to move this economy forward, get better revenue streams, reduce the deficit, create the right kind of mix, can you cut your way out of this?
Well, if
that's the only scenario you have, that we're just going to cut the budget.
So our estimates say that if you were to have sharper cuts in spending than those already embodied in current law,
and that means the automatic caps,
then we would come back to you with a lower projection of economic growth in the next few years. Depending on what happened to those policies over time, we might have different sorts of answers to the effect on the economy later in the decade. Depends whether those policies were sustained, what other changes might be made in the budget. But in the next few years, further cuts in spending beyond those in the Budget Control Act, or increases in taxes beyond those in current law, would lead to even weaker economic growth.
Would impact economic growth in a negative way.
Yes.
Let me ask you also where we are today, and I actually went back and got the last two, the testimony you've done the last 2 times, which is always interesting. I'm sure you review it and you kind of go, did I really estimate that? Maybe why? But it's interesting, and you have a pattern and a trend, which I kind of like, what I'm going to cite to you, and that is when you do your baseline budget outlooks, and I noted your comment, you said these are benchmarks, not forecast. But you know the problem with that is, of course, when you see an article and it says CBO projects, and they give the headline, then it says there are much dimmer forecasts. And I understand the difference. There is a clear difference between these. But in your documents, and I'm going to use your words, you actually talk about forecast. That's the phrase you use. So we have to help us help you make sure that people understand there is a big difference between forecast and saying here's a benchmark. Because a benchmark is just what it is based on the information you have at that time and some assumptions. Forecasts are using all kinds of other methods to get to that. But when you read the document that says forecast, help us as you do your reports.
I see the problem. It's just very hard. We use the word project or forecast about 50,000 times in those 150 pages.
Right.
And it's hard to say in every case the parenthetical of conditional on current law.
Right. And the benchmark is a very important differentiation. But let me, this is interesting. In 2010, in your report 2 years ago, you said projected 2010 deficit 1.3 trillion, actual 1.29. And then last year you projected deficit for 2011, 1.48 trillion, actual deficit 1.29. Now there's variations. Revenue went up, and we actually spent less. Actually had a combination of the two that are moving us in this. So I have great hope as you project out this next year at 8.9 that it's going to be about a half a point less on the deficit. It's going to be less than what you project in a little over $1 trillion. But also your unemployment projection was always about a half a point off lower, which again I think is great because anytime you over project and it goes down is good news. And so help me, I mean I'm assuming you take probably a much more middle conservative view on these numbers, so because we are a very unpredictable group here and you have to bank that, right? Is that a fair?
Well, so in terms of what you and your colleagues will do, we simply follow current law. So we make no attempt to guess what you and your colleagues might do. It's just simply based on current law.
Right.
For all the other things that we do in our projections, we try to be in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes.
Right.
We're not trying to be conservative. I'm not even sure quite what that means all the time in this context. We see a range of possibilities. We want to give you a sense about what the middle of that distribution is. And I hope everybody understands that the distribution is very wide.
Right.
Lots of things could happen. The unemployment rate, for example, rose a little more than one would have expected given the weakness of GDP earlier in this downturn. And that has been reversed. And that's part of why the unemployment rate came in a little lower than we thought it would, say, at the end of last year.
Right. And the year, actually, in all three of these projections, you were half a point too high. I mean, I'm just looking off of your documents. I'm not.
So I've checked all of them, and I'm glad.
10.1 was one of your projections, and then it was half a point less, half a point less. That's good news. I'm just saying, I like the way you project because my view is your trend line is the right trend line, and I think that's a good point. That your projections may be higher than what may happen. That's my opinion. So I just want to put that. But here are...
I'm rooting for good news too, Senator.
We're all rooting for good news. Let me ask you just a couple quick things, and that is, have you done an analysis? You know, there's this discussion which I oppose, and that's domestic BRACs. In other words, again, going through this whole process of what could happen with domestic bases. I oppose it. I think there's a lot of folks, bipartisan, oppose it. Have you done any analysis now or are planning to in the future to give us an impact of what that might do to the economy if these are implemented over a period of time? Or is it worth it? Let me ask it that way, I guess.
I'm not aware of any work we're doing on that specific topic. I mean, depends how many changes the government makes and how large those changes are. We have a very large economy, even although not as large as it could be at the moment.
But military is a sizable amount of the...
It is a sizable amount. But what would be important would be the magnitude of the changes that such a process would consider, and also just what those changes were. I mean, the extent to which are they closing bases and people don't have jobs in the military anywhere, or are you closing bases and moving people to jobs in other locations? That's the sort of thing we would have to look at.
But if somehow materializes, you have the capacity to analyze that based on the information you're given, if there's enough information.
We can look at some of that. Again, it depends whether...
There's a lot of variables, I guess, in this.
Yes, and whether the macroeconomic analysis is appropriate depends on the scale of the activity. We did an analysis a few years ago of the way that the military manages its arsenals today, which involves some complicated public-private interactions. And we were asked, but weren't really able to provide an answer to the overall economic effects because there were too many unknowns, and we didn't have really an ability, we thought, to do this sort of analysis that we would have liked to do.
Very good. I'll end there. I do have some questions regarding impacts of natural resource development, obviously oil and gas, and what that could mean. As you know, my state, the chairman's state, has huge growth potential, job potential, and actually revenue stream for the federal government. So I'll hold that. I'll give it to you in writing so we can get a little more detail of what that impacts.
We're happy to speak to that, Senator.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for your testimony today and all the work you did in relationship to the so-called super committee, which turned out to be not that super. But we really appreciated the work of your team, some of whom are with you today. And we did, as you know, do a lot of good analysis that I think can be helpful going forward. As you said in answer to the chairman's question and ranking member's question, the confidence that people are looking for in this economy would be helped enormously by having a plan. And part of that plan, of course, is what the super committee was not able to arrive at, but what we still have to do. The problem doesn't go away, it gets worse. And in my view, part of that plan includes tax reform, not just tax increases. And so in the context of that, let me ask you a couple questions about the tax side. First, with regard to your report this week, which was very helpful, the alternative baseline, as you know, shows that the tax extension basically would save jobs. And you've apparently, looking at your testimony, referred to that. Basically, as I look at it, you're saying that under your Table 2.2, which is the alternative baseline, that if you let the tax cuts expire, it will play a significant role in having economic growth be reduced substantially. And in essence, when you look at it, because you're projecting unemployment rates of 8.9, 9.2, 8.3% over the next few years, you are saying that with growth about 3 points higher in 2013 and unemployment a full percentage point lower with the tax cuts continuing, that the tax cuts really play the lead role in costing about 1.5 million jobs. And admittedly, there are other factors here. The BCA sequestrations are canceled, the Medicare doc fix continues, but the tax cuts are by far the largest part of that. Can you comment on that? And also, since you have calculated the growth impacts of keeping the tax cuts, which again I think is helpful work, why didn't you incorporate those growth effects into the estimated costs of keeping the tax cuts? Clearly, those growth effects would create feedback revenues and thereby lower the cost of keeping the tax cuts. Did you think about including that as well as the growth impacts of keeping them?
So two quick points, Senator. The first, as you know from this table, we talk about the economic effects in 2013 and also the economic effects in 2022. You've highlighted the effects in 2013, in which case extending the expiring tax provisions and not implementing all of the cuts in spending under current law would provide a boost in 2013. And our estimate of the tax part of that alone is that it would add, extending those provisions would add between 0.5 and 2.5 million full-time equivalent jobs in 2013. But in 2022, the effects are quite different. In 2022, this alternative scenario has significantly lower GNP than in the baseline, and that's because the accumulating debt weighs on the economy more than the lower tax rates boost the economy in our estimates. On the matter of why we didn't do an estimate of the alternative fiscal scenario that incorporated its economic effects, I think that's basically the answer to that is a practical matter in the time we have to put this outlook together. To do an entire second set of budget estimates on a different economic baseline is just too complicated. We do, as you know, even better than I perhaps from your experience at OMB, there are an awful lot of accounts in the federal budget. So we do a very detailed job of looking at each of those as part of our baselines, and on a single set of economic assumptions. And then we try to illustrate the effects of alternatives. But it's just not possible to do all of that original work again on a second set of economic assumptions. I think you're right to say that in 2013, that stronger economy would itself make the budget a little better off. It's also true, though, in 2022, the weaker economy would make the budget a little worse off than we're showing here. So it's not the case that we're systematically on one side. It depends what year you look at. It just illustrates the complexity for us of trying to do the sort of analysis on the full analysis on two distinct economic baselines.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I do think it's obviously a significant impact. You're talking about 500,000 to 2.5 million jobs in 2013 alone, which is something that we ought to be cognizant of as we look at these tax cuts, and in particular the pro-growth ones. And I would say the 2003 tax cuts might be different in kind. As you talked about earlier, not all spending is equal, not all tax cuts are equal. And that's something that this committee needs to be looking at as we talk about the budget going forward, because it's a huge impact on jobs at a time when, as you say, short term we need a boost, and clearly the tax cuts provide that. We talked earlier about times at which the spending was at 20% and times in which the taxes as a percent of our GDP was at 18%, and the chairman talked about the fact that we have not had a balanced budget when the revenue was at a historic level, which is at about 18.3% of GDP. I would say that in 2007, again, I happened to be at OMB at the time, but that's where we were. And although we had a budget deficit, it was 1.2% of the economy, which many economists would view as minimal. So we have had times like that where we've had growth in the economy, and we're able at 18.3% to achieve at least very close to a balanced budget. And in fact, as you know, we had a 5-year plan to get to that balance. The tax cuts are often blamed for fiscal woes, notwithstanding that. And when I look at your analysis, of course, it shows that even if all of the current tax relief, 2001, 2003, continued, we get back up to that 18.3% level. On the flip side, the current policy baseline shows us spending at 23.2% of GDP by 2022, which is about 3% above the historic average. So this notion as to what the issue is, spending or taxes, based on the historic average, obviously the spending is going higher and the taxes are back to the historic level. So in a way, the reason the deficit is going to be about 3% of GDP higher than average is because spending is about 3% of GDP higher than the historic average. And there's no long-term revenue decline at all. It's really all from the rising spending. So again, I'm supportive of tax reform, but I do think we need to take that into account. And since my time is up, I look forward to your response maybe to other folks on that issue. But I think through tax reform you can generate more economic growth and therefore more revenue, and that would be the better way to go rather than looking at raising taxes at a time of a tough economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, welcome back.
Thank you, Senator.
First a comment, then a question. The comment is that as we face these issues, the problem of our healthcare system remains enormous. You and I have discussed beforehand the scoring problems of addressing delivery system reform, and I appreciate and I understand those. I just hope that as you, as an important voice in this debate, go around and talk about this, that you don't become the captive of your methodology and avoid discussing the potential benefits to our economy of delivery system reform simply because it's not quantifiable by the metrics of your organization. I think that we have two separate questions here. One is what you can score, and the other is what's the right thing to do. And I hope that you will point out as often as you can that solving the excessive cost in our healthcare system by improving the quality of care is a very good thing to do, even if OMB can't score it. CBO can't score it.
Yes, Senator. So of course, there's a tremendous distinction between things that we estimate and the effects we estimate and the set of issues that you and other of our elected leaders should take into account in making decisions. And I think it's universal view among analysts of the U.S. healthcare system that improvements in the delivery of healthcare are critical to our getting greater value for our dollar. and I would certainly not speak against that point at all. The harder question for us is which specific sorts of government policies that are brought to us to analyze would have what effects on the delivery system. And those are, and we do a lot of work, as you know, to try to learn all we can to make the best estimates we can, but it is a very uncertain business. As you know, we just released an issue brief with 2 backup working papers reviewing some of the recent Medicare demonstration projects on coordinating the delivery of care and on paying providers not just for the quantity of services, but paying them for doing a good job. So we're studying that literature very carefully and talking with practitioners all the time.
Let me switch to a different topic, which is the so-called Buffett rule. The President spoke about it in his State of the Union. I've been working on a bill for a while now that we've just filed. There is obviously a direct revenue effect when, to use one of the examples, the 400 highest income earners in the country who earned on average over $250 million each during that reported year turned out to have paid net 18.2% in, on average, in total federal taxes. And you look at what middle income people pay, and it's very often higher than that. So there's an upside down quality for certain people in our supposedly progressive tax code. And when you bring them up to the closer to the nominal level with a minimum, the way the Buffett rule would, obviously that will create additional revenues for the government that can be used to address the deficit and other issues. We have a request into the Joint Committee on Taxation right now on that. We'll find out what that number is. The argument against it is that the folks who are involved in these hedge funds and so forth are such magnificent job creators that we should indulge the favored treatment in the tax code in favor of that job creation that they create. I'm wondering if that is an issue that you look at, if there's an offset of some kind that is appropriate to the revenues based on diminished job creation when folks like that have to pay a 30% instead of a 15 or an 18 or a 14 or, I guess, in Mr. Buffett's case, one year an 11% tax rate. How do you evaluate those two priorities, and what kind of an offset should we be thinking about in terms of diminished job growth when these so-called job creators are no longer treated so munificently under the tax code?
Senator, I think we would be very hard-pressed to provide any analysis of the effect of a tax change that's as narrowly targeted as the one that you seem to be discussing. I mean, the evidence that economists have collected on the effects of changes in tax rates and other features of the tax code on people's behavior generally involves fairly broad swaths of the population. An average data set, you don't get a lot of people who are in the top 400 in the country. So I think as tax policy focuses more and more, in your example, on a smaller group, then our ability to analyze the economic effects of that become increasingly attenuated. So I don't know what we could do on that topic at all.
As a practical matter, does it make a lot of sense to think that somebody who's making $270 million a year, which was the average number in the 400 for the last reported year, would significantly change their behavior because their tax rate moved from 18 to 30%?
I don't know. I just don't know, Senator. I mean, what's often noted is that some people have a lot of flexibility in how they arrange their financial affairs so that taxable income can be more sensitive than underlying work behavior or saving behavior, but it also means it's harder to disentangle from tax return data how much of the changes that one might see reflect underlying economic behavior versus accounting changes. I don't envy our colleagues of the South Joint Committee on Taxation to try to estimate the revenue effects, and I don't know what we could do beyond that. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Doctor.
Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield. I'd be Senator Thune is next, and then Senator Ayotte.
I thank Senator Sessions. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Elmendorf, for being with us today. I want to ask you some questions about what perhaps the biggest news on health care was, and that's the CBO decision to remove the class program from the January 2012 baseline. Despite that development, there was no mention of class in your testimony, and as you know, in the final cost estimate of the health care legislation, which was issued in March 20 of 2010, CBO projected that class would save $70 billion in its first decade. Those savings represented nearly 60% of the total and 75% of the on-budget deficit reduction shown in CBO's estimate of the health care law over the 10-year window. CBO's estimate of class and subsequent baseline updates did not take into account the substantial risk that the program would be insolvent and workable, even though a significant amount of evidence suggested that that was a likely outcome. And as recently as the last baseline update in August of 2011, you had stood by CBO's original class estimate. That is that in August you only assumed that the program's implementation would be delayed by about a year. On September the 22nd, the class actuary indicated that the class office at HHS was closing. On October 14th, the Secretary of HHS, Kathleen Sebelius, officially notified Congress that there was no viable path forward to implement the class program. And then on October the 17th, CBO responded to the administration's announcement by indicating it would remove class from its baseline in January. And I guess my question is, why did CBO's estimate of class during the health care debate fail to account for the significant risk that the program could not be made solvent or workable?
So, Senator, I respectfully disagree with the premise of the question. The estimate that we made for the class program and for all the pieces of the health care legislation recognized that there was substantial uncertainty. And in the multiple letters that we wrote about the class program over the course of its evolution into law, we emphasized the uncertainty around that. The challenge for us when faced with uncertainty is to try to determine what a reasonable middle point is in the range of possible outcomes. We recognized there was some risk the program would never get off the ground. There was some chance the program would get off the ground and would later crumble. There was some chance the program would get off the ground and would not crumble. And so for us to have actually said in our estimate that the effect would be zero on the budget, we would have had to have great confidence that the program not only would ultimately fail, but it would be recognized before it started that it would fail. And I don't think that actually was the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. Now, obviously, after the fact, it was not a good estimate. After the fact, it turned out that the thing could not be made viable. And I wish we'd known that going in, but I don't think it's actually reasonable to say that we should have known that. For example, the Office of the Actuary at CMS, who also spoke about Rick Foster spoke about his concerns about the viability of the program, but their estimate of the effects of the legislation showed about $40 billion of net receipts for the government in the first decade from the class program. That's less than our 70-something. So they were closer to the ultimate answer of zero. But they didn't put down zero at that time either, because I don't know. I have not talked with Rick about this. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my guess would be they, like we, weren't sure what was going to happen. And since the zero was sort of one end of the possible distribution over the first decade, that was not the middle of the distribution. We also, as you know, were very clear in these letters to emphasize that the program would turn around later in time, and that if one looked over a longer time horizon, that it would ultimately become, even if it were working in the sense in which it was intended to work, it would ultimately become a drag on the budget. And we emphasized that in the letters that we wrote to a number of your colleagues as that process was going on.
Well, what was the evidence that CBO used in determining its key assumptions in designing the class model? Because I understand what you're saying about, of course, in the early years when you're getting premium income in, you're going to show positive, perhaps, cash flow. But it was abundantly clear from the statements of the actuary that when you got into the second decade and beyond, that this thing was a sure loser. And he made that very clear. He said in 36 years of actuarial experience, I can't come to any other conclusion but that this thing is going to fail. That was what Foster said at the time. And so the score, because of the front loading of this, I understand how you came up with the score, but it seems to me at least that there should have been some suggestion to the Congress that at least that this thing was likely to fail. I mean, that's what the actuary was saying. And so what were your assumptions in determining?
Again, Senator, I think I don't have them at hand, but I think if you go back to the letters that we wrote to a number of senators over the course of that period, we deliberately emphasized that the cash flow of the program in the first decade was not representative of what it would be in subsequent decades, that it would in fact turn around. We took some pains to explain why that was the case, even in a program that was actuarially working, because, as you say, the money comes in up front and is paid out later. So we took some pains to emphasize that point. When we constructed the estimate, we talked with outside, we have some expertise in long-term care issues a little, but we also talked a great deal with outside actuaries and other experts. I think all of them raised concerns that it might not work. But as we talked with people, we did not get a, I think we had very few people who were convinced it would be so obvious it would not work that it would never be started. And I think a fair number who thought it would be started but then would ultimately fail. So we had a range of views. And again, we tried in the writing we did to explain that this was a very uncertain part of what we were doing. Again, in retrospect, it was not a good estimate. I'm not saying we had the right number. Obviously, we did not. But I don't think it's so obvious that we should have known that much better then. And again, I emphasize the actuary not to hold out, not to try to pull him in with us necessarily, but just to say that for all the skepticism that Rick Foster expressed, and he did that clearly, they themselves didn't view 0 as apparently as the best middle ground estimate to provide. Do I wish that we had known more then? Yes, no doubt. I mean, I don't take lightly projections of ours that turn out to be wrong. But I also think that it wasn't so obvious at the time we were making that estimate that the program would never be launched.
Okay. I see my time has expired. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I just say on this point to my colleague, you know, on the original iteration of the Class Act, I called it a Ponzi scheme. I think the Senator quoted me on the floor.
More than
that I said that, yeah, more, I remember quite often those words coming up. And part of my analysis was based on CBO analysis and the actuaries' analysis that told me in the early years it was cash flow positive because premiums come in, but that worm turned, especially when you got to the second 10 years. It was very clear to me that it wouldn't work. But I mean, I must say part of my analysis was based on what CBO provided us, I think a number of us in writing, acknowledging, yes, you get money on the front end, but then that worm turns, and the work of the actuary.
Mr. Chairman, I congratulate you and thank you for that courageous statement, actually. I think it was an important thing for you to say. My prior colleague here, Judge Gregg, got in language that required the Secretary to certify that it would be sound over a long period of time, and she couldn't certify it. So hopefully we've avoided this result. I would just say one thing, and Mr. Elmendorf knows this, that there are a lot of very, very skilled people in this town that know how to read your reports, and it taken out of context or improperly allowed the debate to continue on the floor of the Senate and the President to assert that this was a program that was going to make money for the government. And that was not accurate. So I felt pretty, Senator Thune led the battle on it to try to point out that it was not going to make money for the government, but that surplus that you scored was used to reduce the cost of the President's plan. And that, in the short run, maybe it would have if it had been implemented, but in the long run it would have been a cost, and we do need to figure out how to use your scores more objectively. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we work hard to try to explain ourselves and explain our numbers in a way that makes the most possible people understand them and the fewest possible people misuse them. But as you know, and I don't think that we always get that language just right, but we work very hard at it. And we are at least as bothered as anyone else if we think that numbers we've done, analysis we've done, is being used out of context to convey things that we have not said.
Mr. Chairman, I have a bill to repeal. that, so happy to have you on board as a co-sponsor if you'd like.
You know, I'm always interested in the legislative offerings of my colleague from South Dakota. At some point, we're going to have a hearing on the history of North and South Dakota before this committee. Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, you essentially lay out these two scenarios in your testimony. The first, the Congress does nothing to change current law, the Bush tax cuts sunset, AMT patch collapses, and the Budget Control Act's, in effect, spending cuts kick in. Bad for the economy, good for the deficit is essentially where you go. The second one is your alternative scenario. Congress extends the Bush tax cuts and the AMT patch while it blocks most of the spending cuts required by the Budget Control Act. Something like this, according to your analysis, makes the deficit much worse, but it's better for the economy. So that leaves us with these two scenarios that are singularly unappealing and probably compounded by the fact that if the Congress does nothing, you have this kind of meltdown in the lame duck session of 2012, much like the lame duck session, of 2010. So it won't surprise you. I want to ask you about the third scenario and pick up on Senator Portman's point with respect to tax reform. And on this, I understood your answer and respect it, that you couldn't do a full kind of quantitative analysis of a third approach. So I want to start by picking up on statements you've made that are on the public record that ought to be encouraging for those of us in this kind of third space where we'd like to have pro-growth tax reform. For example, I was very pleased that in the discussion about that came up in connection with the super committee that you said it was possible to write a pro-growth and progressive tax reform that would generate revenue for the government. You were asked that super committee, and again, absent the details, that was something that was useful for those of us that have tried to constantly come back to this third path between the sort of parade, of horribles. So let's pick up on that. Are there any reasons, for example, that you can give us based on the analyses that you've done thus far that would suggest that pro-growth tax reform would be a problem? I mean, you and I have talked about the outcome in 1986 when a big group of liberal Democrats and Ronald Reagan got together and we created 6.3 million new jobs, in 2 years. So let me steer clear of you having to give a quantitative analysis of a third patch. Let me note the fact you said something that was pretty encouraging to tax reformers in the context of the super committee where you said it could actually score revenue, a view that I share. Are there any factors that you know of based on the work you've done thus far that would suggest that the kind of pro-growth tax reform where you clean out the special interest, breaks, to hold down rates for everybody and keep progressivity, that would be problematic if we can muster the support for this third kind of path?
So, of course, depending on the specific senator,
right.
I think analysts would widely agree that reform of the tax code that broadened the base and brought down rates would be a positive force for economic growth, both in the short term and over a longer period.
And with respect to any kind of warning signals, I mean, it would seem to me, for example, precipitous action, Chairman Conrad and I have talked about this, if you had poorly drafted transition rules, for example, as part of a tax reform, and Chairman Baucus is certainly going to be very sensitive to this, as with Senator Hatch. I mean, I can't see any kind of warning lights other than those kinds of issues, which I think there'd be a lot of sensitivity on both sides of the aisle. Any other kind of warning lights? And again, let me respect you on the absence of being able to do a quantitative analysis, liked what you said in the super committee. Any warning lights?
Well, again, so it's not just the quantitative analysis. Even the qualitative statement does depend on the specifics, as I said carefully at the beginning of my last sentence. But I think in general, it's quite possible to design a reform of the tax code that would have the characteristics of broadening the base and lowering rates with appropriate transition rules that would make the economy stronger. It's also possible to do it badly and end up making the economy worse off. But your presumptions seem to be that it would be done in a sensible fashion.
Well, my hope is that you get asked to do the quantitative analysis of this third path sooner rather than later, because I think this has been very helpful, today to have you lay out the two alternatives, both of whom should strike any reasonable person, regardless of their political views, as unacceptable for the country, unacceptable, and particularly given the challenges in Europe. I mean, these two paths are bad news for America, and there is a path, and I've been encouraged about what you've had to say in the past, and I hope you're going to get asked for that quantitative analysis by people whose pay grade is above mine, because I think history and the psychology of the country seeing something big and bipartisan. And by the way, I think Senator Whitehouse has made a number of good points. Ironically, with respect to the Buffett rule, I was struck in talking about tax reform. Senator Coates and I have a top rate which is lower than the rate, excuse me, that it is higher than the rate that Senator Whitehouse has been talking about. So there's plenty of opportunities here for some common ground, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to just take this moment to recognize once again the remarkable amount of serious work that Senator Wyden has produced without the benefit of a committee chairmanship on fundamental tax reform and on health care reform. And I just want to thank him for it. I think it's an enormous contribution. Senator Sessions.
Senator Ayotte. While she was preparing, I would join in that, and it is tremendous amount of effort that it takes. And Senator Wyden, I appreciate your leadership, and all of us in the Senate are watching your work, and we appreciate it.
Senator Ayotte is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Sessions. Dr. Elmendorf, I understand that you testified before the House committee yesterday that we can get to 2013 without raising the debt ceiling again or without additional extraordinary measures. So my question to you is this. We're at a point where the President has requested and the Congress has allowed the debt ceiling to go to $16.4 trillion. Our total debt right now is about $15.3 trillion and surpasses the size of our economy. It's a huge number. You've issued this estimate that we won't have to have another increase of the debt ceiling before 2013. And I simply have this question for you is, what could further balloon our debt, and what keeps you awake at night when it comes to the issues you're most worried about in terms of having our debt get out of control and also further increasing in a way that you haven't been able to estimate?
So, Senator, what I said yesterday was that we think, given our current projections, that the government can get to 2013 without needing to raise the debt ceiling. I also emphasized a great deal of uncertainty about what will happen in the economy and tax collections and spending over the coming year, as well as, of course, actions that Congress may take that may lead to additional government borrowing. So I don't want to, nobody should think that that estimate is somehow cast in stone. It is at the very least conditional on current law and on our current economic outlook. A lot of things keep me awake at night worrying about the state of the federal budget. You're paying me partly to do that. I think a particular risk over the coming decade is that interest rates will rise further and more sharply than we have in the projection. I don't think the risk in interest rates is one-sided. Our projection of interest rates over the second half of the decade is actually well above the interest rates that are implicit in the current prices of Treasury securities being traded in financial markets. So there's downside risk as well, but I worry about the chance that creditors or potential creditors of the United States government will become concerned about the trajectory of the debt and concerned about whether policymakers are willing and able to confront the challenges and change course. And I think when you see other countries that have encountered fiscal crises, it is not just that something special happens in the numbers, although sometimes that is the case, but also it can be because investors' perception of the ability of a government to manage its finances can turn very rapidly and in ways that are very hard to predict. Beyond that, I mean, the budget projection we have, even under either of the scenarios for policy choices, could be way off because the economy could rebound more quickly than we think. This has already been a very long downturn by historical standards. Progress is being made, we think, in clearing out some of the problems that have been hanging over the economy. Economy could grow more rapidly. It's also true, though, that in economies that have suffered from financial crises of the sort that ours did, that some countries took many more years to finally climb out of the hole their economies fell into than we have in this projection. So there are uncertainties on both sides.
Can you help me in terms of when we talk about the rise in interest rates, just to give us a sense of a number? So let's say the interest rates, excuse me, increase 1%. What does it do in terms of what we have to pay back? You know, and I understand this is an estimate, but if you can give me a sense, just so people in the public understand, I mean, there is an urgency to us addressing our debt because when the interest rates rise, what we have to pay back is so much greater. And we have scuffles around here. Last March, we had a scuffle around here over $60 billion in reductions. And just 1% an increase in interest rates, if you can give us a sense of that, I think it puts in perspective that our scuffles are really minor compared to the issue we have to address.
So we do, in fact, show in the Outlook a table of how certain economic changes might affect the budget. And our estimate is that if interest rates were 1 percentage point higher throughout the coming decade, that would add nearly $1 trillion to the cumulative deficit over the decade.
It really puts into perspective when we're fighting over reducing spending by $60 billion that we've got to do a lot better around here in terms of the decisions that we have to make. And
Senator, might I just interrupt, and not on your time, but ask the director to repeat that, because I think the question you've asked is so important that that message be understood by those listening, our colleagues, staffs, and people who might be listening via television. If you'd repeat the
So our estimates are that if the Treasury interest rates were 1 percentage point higher throughout the coming decade, that would add about $1 trillion to the cumulative deficit over the decade.
It's really staggering, and it points out the urgency of us going forward with a debt reduction plan, a bipartisan debt reduction plan that addresses where we are going and the sustainability of our debt. And I've been a supporter of the efforts, and I know the chairman has been as well, is to go big and really address this issue head on. And I want to ask one other quick question, which is, what is your view on the impact of what's happening in Europe, and how could that impact here in terms of our fiscal health?
So the situation in Europe has, there's some cross currents in how it affects our economy. If European economies suffer from a worse recession than we were projecting, that'll reduce their demand for our goods and services, reduce our exports. It's also true that if their financial system suffers from yet larger problems, that could affect the health of financial institutions in the United States and thereby affect the flow of credit to private borrowers, businesses, and households in the United States. At the same time, though, the concerns of investors about the situation in Europe has so far led them to invest more in the United States and in U.S. Treasury securities. So one of the factors that's pushed down the interest rates the U.S. Treasury is now paying is actually fear of what's happening in Europe and investors' desire to come to a place that they think is in better shape. So if the situation in Europe were to worsen, there would be some important factors that could be very bad for our economy. There are also some channels through which our, in a perverse sort of way, we would be better off because we would be viewed as being relatively a better investment than Europe would be. I think we do worry about the risks to the U.S. economy of a worse outcome in Europe. I mean, I think that is a topic we've discussed a number of times with our panel of economic advisors. We built into this projection shallow recession in Europe, which is consistent, I think, with the latest consensus forecasts. We didn't find a way to quantify a particular alternative European scenario. And part of that is that we're very unsure what the financial connections are, and just how a particular sort of financial debacle in Europe would reverberate on U.S. financial institutions is a very hard thing for us to know.
Thank you.
I thank the Senator. Senator Sessions, and I want to thank Senator Sessions for his courtesy, knowing that I need to leave here at noon. I appreciate very much how he held off in his round in case we needed the time. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elmendorf, I appreciate CBO's work. I think you do very valuable work. You missed the GDP this year. I think you were at 2.7 predicting it, and it came in at 1.7. But Mr. Zandy at the great Moody's was at 4%, and it came in at 1.7. So I give you credit for being a bit more accurate than some of the other experts. I would just say that all of us need to understand that the challenges we face with regard to debt and the unsustainable fiscal course we're on is that debt creates risk throughout the system and puts us in a more dangerous area if some unexpected shock occurs. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely, Senator.
Things that you can't predict.
Yes.
You just can't predict them, but periodically history shows do happen.
Yes, that's one of the costs of higher debt that we highlighted in our issue brief, as you know, on the risk of a fiscal crisis.
And so I think we need to get that margin down, a larger margin between what the maximum debt this nation can possibly carry and get well below that so we're in a position to avoid shock. You know, you can't borrow your way out of debt. We're living beyond our means. Bill Gross at the PIMCO was quoted recently that we're in a 5 to 15 year period of below normal growth because of deleveraging. And he projected, I guess he's sold more bonds than anybody in the history of the world, and he says that families have to take more money than they used to control their debt, pay down their debt. The government's absorbed huge amounts of debt, which has got to be reduced, leaving less money to be spent in the economy for consumption. Would you agree that the deleveraging process is going to take many years, and do you have an opinion? And will that deleveraging process pretty inevitably mean whatever the growth rate would be, it would be somewhat lower?
So yes, Senator, we think that the deleveraging process is holding down consumer spending now, and that is part of why the recovery is proceeding slowly. How long it will go on for is very difficult for us to know. We have a project underway trying to examine the causes of the slow economic recovery. We're doing that partly just to inform you, but partly to inform ourselves, so our future economic forecasts will benefit from a better understanding of just what has been going on in the past few years. It's difficult to know. As I mentioned to Senator Ayotte, if you look at across countries that have experienced financial crises, they tend to have very slow recoveries. But they differ a lot in what happens. They differ partly because of government policies and partly because of underlying economic conditions. So we're trying to extract lessons from that, but it's a challenge.
Well, I'm worried about it. The Europeans seem to have decided and entered a compact recently that they were going to bring down their spending and their debt. And I'm afraid that's correct, because the solution to this unacceptable high debt that we've been given from the President is borrow more and spend more so the economy won't get weaker. So, just for common sense, I think that's a dangerous policy. The Europeans, I don't think, are following that. On the defense situation, I missed yesterday, Mr. Chairman, because they had the Defense Department major briefing to the Armed Services Committee, of which I'm a member, over their projections, and they're presuming to cut about $489 billion, and that savings is what they're working on. And the President sort of indicated in his State of the Union indirectly that that may be all. That's all they're planning to cut. But if the sequester occurs, that's almost another $500 billion. The way we calculate it, Mr. Elmendorf, if I'm off or if you can give an opinion, I appreciate it. The way we calculate it in real dollars over 10 years, the Defense Department under the sequester in nominal dollars would get 2% more money. But in inflation-adjusted real dollars, it would amount to about a 20% cut, whereas the remaining 5/6 of the federal government over that same period of time with inflation-adjusted dollars would achieve a 50% increase. Does that sound correct to you?
So I don't know this precise number, Senator. As you know, the Budget Control Act exempted Social Security, Medicaid from the sequester, and some other programs, limited the sequester ability for Medicare. Our estimates are that defense spending would come in about over the decade, would come in about 10% under the sequester relative to what would have been our traditional baseline projection of spending growing with inflation. I think the gap between that traditional projection and the effects of the sequester is about 10% in terms of defense spending over the coming decade.
I don't know. It's possible we were using the President's budget for defense and you're using a baseline number. I don't know.
That is a complication in considering these costs. We show this in Table 3.5 in the report, so if I've done my math wrong.
If you do that, you probably would show even greater growth. I don't know what you would show in the other programs. But I guess Medicare and Social Security today represent about 48% of the total budget. Is that right?
I'm not sure. It's a very large share. That sounds about right.
The reason I say that, Mr. Chairman, we've been saying 60%. And, of course, that share is growing. But there are other entitlements. There are pension plans. The largest growing entitlement and the fastest is food stamps, which is an entitlement program that's gone from $20 to $80 billion in 10 years. That's the fourth largest entitlement program. Some of the Pell Grants are entitlement programs. So when you put all entitlements together, it's about close to 60%. And I guess from that, you would say, would you not, to get this country on a sound fiscal path, we would need to address the entitlement programs?
I think the combination of past policies regarding entitlements and taxes are not sustainable in combination in the future, particularly because, as I emphasized earlier, the aging of the population and rising costs for health care are ballooning the costs of certain federal programs.
Not only are we having like medical costs going up for Medicare, but more people are coming on the program demanding their benefit.
And that latter factor is actually especially important over the coming decade. There will be a 1/3 increase in the number of Social Security beneficiaries, the number of Medicare beneficiaries over the coming decade.
And this is one of these.
That's not a projection.
Well,
people have been born.
To be precise, but they're out there, and
they're born.
Yes,
they're alive.
So I guess I would conclude the matter is that I do think that the chairman and others who've said it are correct. We'll have to address entitlements and discretionary spending. Defense is the only area that's taken substantial cuts at this point, and it cannot sustain, in my opinion, the full sequester. We're going to have to revisit that without giving up on the reductions in spending that the sequester called for. And I would say I do express disappointment that in the State of the Union address, the President talked not at all about those huge issues facing our country. I went over. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Elmendorf. Thanks to all of the colleagues for participating in an excellent hearing. We've got more hearings next week. I hope colleagues will come and participate. We've got a lot of discussion that needs to occur in this committee to see if we can't find a way to come together. Again, I thank the Director. Committee stands in adjournment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Doctor, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
In a few moments, a House-Senate Conference Committee continues negotiations on extending a